Hello, this is episode 1 of a show that I am going to call I Just Clocked Out. And as the name would suggest, I just clocked out. I grabbed some stuff at the grocery store, and now I'm back at home, and I am going to kick off the show by talking about a book that I just got done reading, which is called The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton. Stephanie Kelton, for a time, I think 5 years, was an economic advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders and to the other members of the Senate Finance Committee. The overall premise of the book, it is very provocatively titled. The idea is that fiscal deficits should not be a concern to the federal government because the United States government issues its own currency. Therefore, it can always create more currency to pay off debt. Deficits obviously being a shortfall between revenue and spending in one year that accumulates into the national debt. That's the thing that people get freaked out about, or don't, depending on your persuasion. Regardless, the idea is historically grounded. There is anthropological evidence for this. Issuing currency is an important part of nation building historically, because it means that the government is able to control markets. It's able to control what gets bought and sold. Obviously, that's very important. That's kind of the whole thing, especially nowadays. It also allows governments to essentially require people to do work, and it gives them a way of paying them back. And it uses taxation, which is this is the key insight of the book. Taxation is not a way of taking away money that people make. It is a way of convincing people to provide goods and services. Essentially, taxes are something that you have to get to, and you need to kind of work backwards from there. The government says, hey, we're going to charge you this amount in taxes. You got to figure out how to get that money, that gold, historically speaking. Not so much anymore. Now we have paper currencies or electronic currencies, which is another big factor in the book. The idea that the government can essentially just debit and credit bank accounts on a computer screen, and that there is really no physical money that is changing hands or that has to change hands. It's all digital, that really underscores the the lie of monetary policy, the idea that there is something to money. There's really not. This is at least her perspective in the book. I think it is pretty compelling. I think that at first glance you'd hear that and you'd say, well, if the government can do that, why wouldn't they have done it already? There are certain reasons for that. The most important one in the book that she brings up, and the most important one in real life as well, is that the government needs to control inflation. That's really the trick of spending in Stephanie Kelton's mind, is not so much to make sure that tax revenues are in balance with government spending, but to make sure that the economy as a whole is balanced. This is an approach referred to as functional finance. And the idea is that the government should spend into the economy at a level that allows all of the real resources in the economy to be utilized and to get us to full employment. Her idea of full employment is 0% unemployment. That's probably not true in my opinion. It's probably the quote-unquote natural rate of unemployment, which is an important assumption that we use nowadays in economic policy making. Most people nowadays would say that it's between 3.5% to 5.5%, probably, maybe as high as 6.5%, something like that. That's probably too high. That was the idea, back in the 80s and 90s for a time. Now it's more like 3.5% to 5%, I guess. So I contradicted myself. I was wrong initially. Sorry. I would say that the natural rate of unemployment is probably more like 1 to 2.5%. Of course, there's another important variable here, which is labor force participation. Unemployment measures people who are trying to get a job but cannot. Labor force participation is how many people are trying to get a job. So there's a whole bunch of people who are not even trying to get a job because either maybe they're disabled, maybe they just don't want to work, maybe they're disillusioned because they've been trying to get a job and they weren't able to. There are all sorts of reasons why people don't seek work. That is a whole separate thing that is not included in the unemployment rate. There are two measures that Stephanie Kelton mentions in this book. There is U3, which is the measure that I just mentioned. There's also U6, which includes people who are quote unquote underemployed, people who would like to be making more money and working more than they are right now, but they can only get a part-time job. Maybe they have 2 part-time jobs, it's still not making it work, that sort of thing. So the key of the book is the idea that you need to focus on inflation rather than the government deficit. I think that's true. I think it's a very good point. I also think she kind of gets away from that idea in the middle of the book, loses a lot of nuance in the middle chapters. She brings it back around at the end. It still leaves me a little wanting. I definitely recommend the book. I'm rambling. It's the first episode. Sorry. I also don't want to give away too much of the book because I think it's a worthwhile read. But I agree with the overall premise that inflation should be the real target of government spending rather than deficits and the national debt. I also think there are a lot of times where government surpluses are valuable because the economy is inflated. There's also a whole separate issue of, the interaction between fiscal policy, aka government spending, and monetary policy, which is what the Federal Reserve does in trying to set interest rates. That's a whole other thing. I'm sure I'll get around to that eventually because that's kind of a bugbear of mine. I think that high interest rates are good. I think interest rates have been chronically low. They've been way too low for at least the past, 15, 20 years, at least since the Great Recession. I think that they were too low even before that. I think that high interest rates have a lot of value. They allow you to save rather without needing to get into stocks. You can just park your money in a savings account with a decent yield. That's a big deal. Obviously, it's not perfect. There are downsides to it. You're going to get higher mortgage rates. It's harder to borrow money to start a business, et cetera, et cetera. There are a lot of companies out there who are only scraping by because of cheap credit. Not so much anymore, but in the last decade or so, there are a lot of companies that were like that, particularly before COVID. COVID has been kind of a resetting event in a lot of ways, obviously. Again, whole other thing. I'm going to stop there for now. I like the book. I recommend it. Take it with a grain of salt, like anything else. Bye-bye.